signal now for when I'm needed. But when that light hits the sky, it's not just a call. It's a warning to them.
Yes, sir. Welcome to the Gotham Chronicles Beyond the Bat Signal. I am your host, Domenic Iannicca. Join me as we dive into the depths of Batman's lore, dissecting the rogues gallery and uncovering the stories of our iconic vigilante known as the Dark Knight. Now, before we get into today's podcast, first and foremost, thank you very much for tuning in and listening. You have no idea how much I appreciate it. It's taking time out of your day to listen to me. Kind of crazy to say, but and we will get into today's episode, but if you'd like and to help to support the show, feel free to subscribe either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and you can even rate and review the show, which will help spread the word. And then we also have other links, such as like if you want to follow along on YouTube, or even follow along on X/Twitter, which is at Beyond Bat Signal. Or if you have any comments or questions, feel free to shoot me an email at beyondthebatsignal@gmail.com. And that's pretty much it. Now, I am fresh off of going to New York City. What a sports city that is. Wow. With the Rangers, and then, you got the Yankees who are just thumping everyone. I'm out here in Toronto, and they are definitely struggling. And change needs to be made. Anyway, but definitely New York Sports City, they are definitely vibing with the Rangers doing well. I know the Islanders were knocked out of the first round, which was unfortunate. And curious to the listeners in New Jersey, if you guys are hockey fans, how you feel about the Devils not making it through, because your team on paper looks insane. I honestly feel like, you guys would have been a shoo-in had you had a goalie, to be honest. But yeah, love this city of New York, love the state of New York. Can't wait to go back again. I've already been, I think it's my 7th time, but I am going again during Christmas. So looking forward to that. Now, time to get into today's show. What is it about? Well, we're going to be revisiting Icons Unearthed Batman, and we're going to look at episodes 5 and 6. So episode 5 was titled, I'm Not Wearing Hockey Pads. And then you have episode 6, which was In Heath's Shadow. So this one pretty much covers the Nolan trilogy, where, we have Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises. And I felt like they did, overall, a pretty solid job. I think that there was a couple of things that they did graze over, which we'll talk about. And I wish they would give a bit more context. But a lot of it, I would suggest, is worth watching. Definitely worth watching. Even if it was available on Apple or one of those spot, like for us, we don't get Vice TV here, right? But in the States, if you don't have Vice, then there's other ways. Like I know it was on YouTube for a little bit, and then it came down. So that was how I was able to watch it. But if you are able to watch it, like if it comes available, I feel like it's just another nice long documentary. And watching every single one of these episodes wanted me to kind of revisit right back to 89 and watch it all the way through to Dark Knight Rises. Overall, I thought that this was a must-watch for any Batman fan. Pretty interesting, and they interview a lot of people who were in the background. They even bring a couple of other people back, like Renee Montoya. I forget her name, the character who plays. She even had a little interview and kind of giving insight as to what Heath was like and what the set was like, working with Chris Nolan, which I am sure each and every single one of you could assume would be a dream for any actor. Now, kind of going back to, have you ever watched Batman and Robin with George Clooney, Chris O'Donnell? Yeah, well, that was a catastrophe for the studio, right? So, episode 5, I'm Not Wearing Hockey Pads, pretty much starts off with the turmoil left behind of the disaster that Batman and Robin had. The film was made way too quick off of Batman Forever. There was a lot of mistakes, and it almost seems like they went back to what 1966 was, right? And I don't want to trash on 1966. It was a reflection of the time. I didn't mind it. I grew up on appreciating the Adam West Batman. I actually enjoyed it, and that's what made me get into Batman. But you know, where you see a lot of, it was very hokey. It was not a true dark Batman, not even a new true take on Batman. And it was, I guess, trying to appease a very, very young audience. Obviously, you could tell that they're appeasing toy companies with all the changes in the costume. You could see with all the characters, and you know, that was the issue. So now, fast forward, there's multiple attempts to try to reboot the Batman franchise. They wanted to reboot this because they know it's a moneymaker, right? It's Teflon, and they wanted to bring it back. So there's multiple writers that they tried to bring in prior to Chris Nolan. So they had people like Paul Dini. So if you know Paul Dini and Bruce Timm, they were attached to the films to make actually a Batman Beyond movie where I think it was Paul Newman scheduled to play Bruce Wayne, and then you'd have Terry McGinnis played by Keanu Reeves, which would have been very interesting. But that didn't work out. So then they had another idea of Batman versus Superman. Heard that one before. But that was scrapped. And then they had the widely publicized, I feel like I've heard this story several times. It's not news. But Darren Aronofsky's Batman Year One. So they even brought in Frank Miller to help with the writing of this film. But there was a lot of changes. Aronofsky was fresh off of the success of his most recent film prior to like writing for Batman Year One, which was Requiem for a Dream. And, you know, obviously the studio of Warner Brothers approached him to write and direct a new Batman film. So you had Frank Miller to co-write the film, but again, there were so many changes between what Batman Year One was and what the film was going to be. So, for example, you had the Waynes that were murdered. However, Bruce wouldn't have any access to the money left for him. Instead, he was being raised by not Alfred, but a guy named Little Al, who owned a car repair shop. Very different from what, you know, the Batman mythos is and has always been. Very, very different take. And obviously that would not fly with fans, right? Like, you're trying to get the fans' attention and try to make it something a bit more accurate. And Batman and Robin was not it, right? So, and then you have this, where is there going to be a Batman Year One? Kind of odd, because you bring in Frank Miller, who wrote the comic book, to help with the film, and that idea did not fly with Warner Brothers. So then they turn to a young man. They bring their attention to Christopher Nolan, who was directing quite a few independent movies, such as Memento and Insomnia. Now, Insomnia was the first movie Nolan would direct for WB, and it was a critical success by a lot of critics and commercial success, as it brought in quite a bit of money for WB. And obviously that led to WB giving Chris Nolan a call. Now, they shared this story, which I thought was pretty funny, where they were like, listen, let's try to give Chris Nolan a call. We'll give him a shout. And lo and behold, actually his wife, Emma Thomas, answers. And they're like, hey, like, would you be interested in, or would you and Chris be interested in writing and directing a Batman film? And she's like, Christopher will not be interested in doing that. And she hung up. So Chris goes, hey, who was that? She's like, oh, it was WB, and they want you to do a Batman film. I said you wouldn't be interested. Chris was like, what? I would definitely be interested. So Chris Nolan calls back, and that's what got the ball rolling for a new Batman film. And his wife, I honestly would have probably said the same thing. You look at Chris Nolan's filmography and the films that he created, and it's almost like, what? He did the Dark Knight trilogy? Really? Right? It's kind of, I don't know, surprising, to say the least, right? Like, you have all these incredible movies, and then you also have the Dark Knight, which is just like, it's a superhero genre, right? You would never peg him as to be a superhero director, but he was, and a good one at that. So the documentary goes into Chris Nolan's approach, and if you watch any of the Dark Knight trilogy, you know that the approach is going to be grounded, right? It's going to feel like a real life Batman if he were to live in our city. And he wanted everyone to feel like this is a relatable Batman. Like, I can relate to him, and I could be him if I wanted to be. And the other thing was, Chris Nolan, and he's still big on this to this day, is no CGI. He did not want to incorporate any CGI whatsoever, or as little as possible. So, and then, with Chris Nolan, there's always a lot of things that are to secrecy. And it seems like people buy in to what he says. They listen, they respect him. He does have he commands a lot of respect from a lot of actors, producers, even the studio, right? Like, and rightfully so. So one of the big things was he kept the script very, very close to his chest. He didn't want any of the ideas to get out into the wider audience, onto the internet, nothing like that. So if actors were auditioning, it was never going to be the exact script. And it was not necessarily called Batman. It would be for something slightly different. So the actors couldn't even say, oh yeah, I tried to, I wanted to audition for Batman. It never got out. No one really knew who was going to be, like, what they were getting into. Kind of interesting. But then there was a few key individuals that still to this day Nolan keeps close ties with. One of them, newly Oscar winner, Cillian Murphy. Or is it Cillian Murphy? I think it's Cillian. Anyway, Cillian Murphy actually tried out to be Batman / Bruce Wayne. And although he did not get it, I think it was the screen test that kind of was like, he's not quite Batman. That role actually went to one Mr. Christian Bale, who according to that documentary, he knocked it out of the park. So Chris Nolan kept thinking, Cillian Murphy, we have Scarecrow. So, and that's where the role went to. Scarecrow ended up being Cillian Murphy's role, Now, Christian Bale, he's always said, ever since the ending, it's him and Chris Nolan, and they've always been a team. And Christian Bale wants to do Batman right. He has been very vocal by saying, I don't want any bat nipples on here. And they don't want to make a complete mockery as to who Batman is. So if they're going to do this, he said to Nolan, if we're going to do this, we're going to have to be a team. And, Bale was also looking to inspiration. So one of them was the legendary voice actors Kevin Conroy. In case you don't know, if you ever watch Batman the Animated Series back in the early 90s, easily one of my favorite, is my favorite Batman cartoon, hands down. So one thing Kevin Conroy did that was pretty different was he had two voices for Batman, one for Bruce Wayne and then one for Batman. Bruce Wayne would talk normal, a little more positive, a lot more light, and then you'd have the Batman voice, which we got, I'm not wearing hockey pads, and made it a bit more raspy, darker, deeper, and that's what we got. Some people liked Bale's interpretation as to Bruce Wayne's voice, but it's hard to argue. Batman should have a different voice. You should not sound the same as Bruce Wayne, otherwise people are going to catch on. It's not believable. But Bale looked at Batman as three characters. There's Batman. There is the drunk rich guy. So the guy who's, sorry for drinking all of your booze. And Bruce Wayne, who was behind the scenes. He was the guy who was a detective behind the scenes. And he would be talking to Rachel Dawes. He would be the one who's a lot more serious. He was, Bruce Wayne was the mask. But that was drunk Bruce Wayne. But then the other Bruce Wayne was more okay, I'm the detective. And I thought that Batman Begins actually covered that pretty well. Now, there was one big thing that kind of was halting the filming, which was the studio. They didn't want to loosen any funds, right? So Larry Franco was one. He was actually, I believe, secondary director or secondary producer of the, not Schumacher, but the Tim Burton films. And he was looking over all the funds and pleaded with WB to open up the wallet. And the one thing was Nolan wasn't slowing down. He was adding people. He was continuing to help produce, choose locations, and he wanted big names. So he got them, right? Keep in mind, Chris Nolan's still this is not the Chris Nolan that we know now to this day. So he had Michael Caine as Alfred Pennyworth, Gary Oldman as Jim Gordon, Liam Neeson as Ra's al Ghul, and Morgan Freeman as Lucius Fox. Huge names to help support Christian Bale, right? And arguably, you look at that team or that cast, easily one of the strongest teams that you have in a trilogy. Do you not? Right? A lot of films that you see, there's one or two strong actors. Now, you look at something like the Dark Knight trilogy, oh my God, a wealth of talent on the screen. Now, the script was treated like an absolute treasure box, okay? This was not to get out. It was protected. There was even, so actors would review the script, look at it behind closed doors, and then once they were done reading it, there's a security guard waiting outside the room until the actors were done reading the script so they can take it from them. Then they were also talking about a couple of actors that were trying out for certain roles, which I thought was pretty fascinating. Rachel Dawes, yes, there was Katie Holmes who actually got it, and I will talk about Katie Holmes soon. I want to revisit her, but there was other contenders. So Sarah Michelle Gellar, some of you might remember her from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Rachel McAdams, Reese Witherspoon, all big names that were vying for this Rachel Dawes role. Now, Katie Holmes was on Nolan's mind because she actually auditioned for Insomnia, and he was like, okay, I'll keep this in the back of her mind. I thought she did an excellent job at playing Rachel Dawes. Then you also have Cillian Murphy, and then the one thing that they highlighted, which, it was never my favorite Batmobile, but they highlighted it, was the Tumbler Batmobile. So Nolan wanted something that was going to be very realistic. They didn't want something that was just going to be prim, proper, and beautiful, what you got from Batman 89. Easily one of my favorite Batmobiles, right? He wanted something that was believable, something that if Batman's in a chase, he has to cut corners. Yeah, and it's going to withstand a lot of damage again. So Batman needs a tank, It's not a pretty vehicle, but it does the job. It's pretty fast. It still has that jetpack right in the back, which looked pretty sweet. And the chase, there was one thing I can say about the Nolan films, that Batmobile chase was fantastic. Anyways, going back to the the script, the other thing I wanted to add, because I did forget about this, was people that were part of this crew, you would have to sign out the script. And then when you were done, you'd have to sign them back in. And not only that, they even had like a picture of it on the documentary. So this script was printed in bright red. So it could not be copied, which I thought was, again, pretty interesting. Now, when Nolan was writing, he drew actually a lot of inspiration. I would have never thought this, but then it makes sense. So it's like, well, okay, you want a grounded character. Who are you going to get it from? Well, his inspiration was actually from Superman, the movie, back in 1978. And that was because it was grounded. It was realistic. And how can we believe that there is a Bruce Wayne and a Batman in this type of world, right? And that was Nolan's approach. So once filming started beginning, you had Christian Bale showed up on set, and he was actually overweight. And they're like, listen, you're going to need to lose weight and fast, right? So then obviously there was a lot of concern whether he was going to cut weight, be able to fit the suit, right? Obviously he did. He was in ridiculous shape. Because I'm sure there was a couple of scenes where he just looked absolutely ripped. But one thing I wanted to highlight was the other thing. Like they even had where Liam Neeson, I can't remember what he was listed as playing, but it was never Ra's al Ghul. So they kind of kept that under wraps, which again, pretty interesting. The way that episode was done, I thought was brilliant. Right, like they kind of highlight as to who, I think the star of it was who's Chris Nolan. And then they even talked to the makeup artist was episode 6. But anyway, they highlighted like how much money Batman Begins made, which was $373 million at the box office, which is, and not only that, a critic success. So WB obviously naturally wanted a sequel. And Nolan was like, it originally was going to be a one-off. But he had other plans. So, like, he was like, yeah, listen, I'm okay. I'll do a sequel, but I'm going to make The Prestige. So they were like, okay, go do your thing, and then please come back, and we're going to make a Batman sequel. So he went off, made The Prestige, made $100 million, which was considered a big success. And then, they highlight how big Batman Begins was about Bruce losing his parents, and he wanted to protect others. And then what they did was they created The Dark Knight, which was about the people of Gotham and wanting to protection from Batman. And then there's obviously the order versus chaos, which Joker kind of introduces. So this episode doesn't necessarily introduce The Dark Knight. We kind of get into The Dark Knight episode 6, right? So going into The Dark Knight, this was heavily inspired by The Long Halloween and The Killing Joke. So one thing I never realized was The Long Halloween was actually inspired by the Beatles. So there's 4 people coming together, and people who were no longer who they were at the start of the film. Right? So obviously there was a lot of evolution. So they had Bruce Wayne and Batman, Harvey Dent and Two-Face, the Joker, and Jim Gordon, right? Like those were the big 4 Beatles. Bruce Wayne and Batman, obviously there was significant change. Same thing with Harvey Dent and Jim Gordon, right? We noticed a lot of change amongst those guys. But yeah. And then they briefly touch upon Joker's new look, right? So like it was a bit more, rather than him going into a vat of chemicals, they had, like what would it look like if it was more biological reality? So like what if there were cuts on his face? So like the design was done by Jeffrey Henderson. So he was the one who created the Joker look. The other thing was the filming schedule. Regular filming schedules on average 80 days. The Dark Knight 128 days. Then there's new things being tried, like Chris Nolan is notorious with IMAX, right? I love revisiting The Dark Knight because of just the build up, and even just going to watch. I remember it was I Am Legend, right? You had to go watch an IMAX, and then you can go see like it was like the first 6 minutes of that first scene of The Dark Knight, right? Anyway, that was done in IMAX cameras for a first time by Chris Nolan. And then obviously the budget naturally increases because it's a bigger film. The one thing I didn't like was they skimmed over Katie Holmes, right? Like they kind of highlighted in the beginning saying, that it was a mistake to kind of bring her on, but they'll revisit it later. And then they don't really like kind of get into it. They kind of make some excuses. But the big rumor was because she was married to Tom Cruise at the time. So now, I'm not here to be someone that's like, oh, here's like, I'm not one of those like the magazines or this is from what I've read, was that Katie Holmes didn't come back because Tom Cruise didn't want her to. There was a lot of issues of her with being on set, and she just chose to pursue other career options, which was fine. And that's how they kind of did it. They just kind of put it under the rug. They didn't really address what happened, right? They didn't even ask any actors that were part of it, like, hey, what happened? No directors, nothing. It was just kind of narrated by Robert Wuhl, who, again, did an amazing job. Robert Wuhl was Alexander Knox in the Batman 89 film. Anyway, so, they just said that she passed on the sequel, but there's other rumors as to why she would not come back, right? So, obviously, those rumors were oh my gosh, Tommy Cruise, right? So I'm sure you can look it up and find it on the web. Now, they get into episode 6 in Heath's shadow. So this is one I was looking forward to. And I mean, how could you not? It's such a tragedy that we lost Heath Ledger. So you knew that the bulk of this episode was going to be about who Heath was. How did he come up with this character? And then there were certain things that I learned that I was not even aware of, right? Like this whole time, like I just assumed that the Joker's character got to him. Well, no, that wasn't even the case, right? Now, before I get into it, let's jump back. So Heath Ledger, he was chosen, and it was so controversial on the internet. And I remember going to Batman on Film, and Bill Jet Ramey, got to give credit where credit is due here. So he was the one that was just kind of like, and I remember he made a post about this on his website. Just like, people just need to calm down, for lack of better words. Like, I know I'm messing up with it, but I'm paraphrasing what he said. And it's true, right? Like, we haven't seen this character, but they looked at it and like, well, here's this romantic star fresh off Brokeback Mountain, that was it. And what else? 10 Things I Hate About You. And what, now you're going to have him as the Joker? And he's going to try to live up to the hype of Jack Nicholson? Good luck, right? I think we all thought that, like, living up to Jack's Joker, it's going to be tough. We all get it, right? He was so good. Little did we know, though, right? We all jumped to conclusions. Now, Nolan maintained like that this is still going to be as real can be. We're not going to try to use any CGI. So one of the big things that they had that was real, shockingly, was flipping a 60-foot long truck. Now, stunt director Chris Cobalt, that was interesting to hear his perspective. Found a building that was also going to get blown up. Right? That was another part of his job. And again, Chris Nolan wanted to do it real. And he's like, well, if we're going to blow this thing up, well, we can't just all blow it up at once. Like, it should be in sequence. Like, let's go from left all the way to right. So you can cut the way it filmed. And the other big thing was they only had one shot of filming how this place is going to get blown up. So going back to the 60-foot truck, it was going to be filmed in the financial district. And the other thing was it was in Chicago. And there was no margin for error. So being downtown, I'm sure a lot of our downtown cores, it's going to be small. And then you have this massive, huge transport truck, which has to flip over pretty much perfectly straight. It can't lean to one side or the other, right? So you had to do it absolutely perfectly. Now, the Chicago mayor at the time was in full support of this. And again, that truck leans right or left, it could ruin a building. But not only that, the other thing, the obstacle that they had to do, that there was only 50 yards and only one shot. So they had 50 yards to drive this truck and then, boom, flip it, right? So they had like this huge cannon underneath, and that's what happened, right? They flipped it, and obviously, as we see on the screen, it lands absolutely perfectly. That scene alone, the word got out to all actors and producers and everyone that was part of that set. They went to go witness what was about to transpire. They didn't miss it. Like, I think they had Officer Ramirez on there. I'm forgetting her name, but like, she was like, yeah, we all kind of left our trailers and went to go see this trailer flip. And lo and behold, my God. So they even got a stunt guy to do it. And the poor guy, like, he was like, yeah, I'll do it. Right? Because obviously you can't have Heath Ledger being in that truck and flipping. Poor guy. So the truck flips, and he hits his head naturally. Bumps his head at the, I guess you'd say it's the top of the truck, even though it's flipping. So it's bumping once, and then boom, a second time. So he's like, oh yeah, I was feeling dizzy right after that, but I was fine. Took it like a champion, right? Like it was nothing. But it was pretty cool to have that perspective on this episode, right? Like, we're so used to hearing the directors and the actors, but even hearing the stunt guys and what their experience was, I loved it. To me, the most interesting individuals were Chris Cobalt, who ran the stunts, and then you also had the makeup artist, so John Caglione. So he spent hours with Heath Ledger, and I feel like out of all the people that got to know Heath, I think it must have been, aside from Chris Nolan, him. Yeah, I don't know. Now, before, I just want to get through the stunts part. So, like, the Bat Pod obviously was difficult to drive. I'm not sure if a lot of you guys remember listen, you look at that Bat Pod, that bike, it does not look easy. It's long, wide, bulky, and they're able to find one stunt motorcyclist who's able to do this and ride that thing. So God bless him. The other thing that they were worried about was the cape getting stuck in the back tire while they're driving it. But then they're like, okay, well, just try. Like, it was Chris Nolan who had the cape anyway, or it was Chris Nolan who was like, okay, well, we need this cape to flow. It needs to look real. We can't use CGI. There was an idea of Batman having a backpack, but this is Batman. He has to flow with the cape. So obviously, Batman's driving and the cape is just flowing. There was no issues of that cape getting stuck into the tire. Now, the bank robbery was actually that first scene, which again I mentioned was that scene that was on I Am Legend, and it was in April 2007 that started filming. So John Caglione was the makeup artist, spent tons of time with Heath, and he was doing all these sorts of different looks, like dreary, lived in, the crack look. Like, you look throughout the movie, it totally looks like the Joker did his own face paint, right? And that's what he did. He's like, listen, Heath, you got to do your own. Make it look real. Like, we have the design, you try to design. And then that's where they got, like, the whole thing of, well, they had face paint on Heath's fingers, inside his fingernails, right? It looked very much used. So, it got a sense of realism, which was brought to the film, right? You always look at it and you're like, wow, like, this guy had it all over his fingers. It just felt legit. You're never questioning, why wasn't that there? Or why wasn't that there? No. The only thing I had an issue, I wish it would be addressed, was how Harvey Two-Face was so surprised to see Joker in that nurse outfit, and then it's only when he takes off the mask that he reacts like, what the hell are you doing here? Like, the hell's going on here? But yeah, the one sad part was the stuntman that sadly passed away while filming, and I thought that it wasn't overlooked whatsoever. I think it was difficult for a lot of people to discuss. But it was so tragic, and it was such a fluke, and they kind of did address that. So Chris Cobalt, he had a difficult time talking about it. He's just like, no, I won't go there. But it did involve the tumbler. So what the guy was supposed to do, or he did do, was he was leaning out the window, using his iPhone, for heaven's sake, and just filming what the tumbler was looking like, how it's driving, so he can send it to Chris Nolan. Well, the driver, the driver slams his brakes, and with this guy kind of having his head out, and doesn't he crack his neck? Sounds kind of morbid, I know. But that's what happened. So, like, talk about tragic. Fluke accident, and that happens. Now, going back to Chris Nolan, I mentioned that they had Ramirez, who was interviewed, and she was just saying, like, complimenting, praising Chris Nolan. It's like, Chris, the production for him, it's always like a well-oiled machine. I kind of admire that. Heath, the one thing, and I have revisited The Dark Knight multiple times. I feel like, though, whenever I watch The Dark Knight, it's always like a special occasion. Not a special occasion, but like I have to actually pay attention to it. I won't have it playing on the background. It's almost like that kind of respect. Even though, like, I'll have Batman 89, Mask of the Phantasm play in the background, and I know exactly what's going on. But The Dark Knight, I sit and watch. I don't know if any of you do that. Anyway. Going back to Heath Ledger. So, the one thing he had was everyone's lines memorized. So, he would know everyone's lines before, like, if they forgot it, he would kind of, like, let them know. Like, okay, well, you're supposed to say this, this, and this, right? That man was so devoted to what he was doing. Like, he even knew what everyone else's lines were. Now, the one thing, so the makeup artist, going back to him, John Caglione, he kind of debunked a couple of things. So they were saying, like, there was rumors that, Heath Ledger was on drugs, and it was because, like, he was so immersed in this Joker character. And he was like, no, that couldn't be further from the truth. So, John Caglione had his own demons that he wrestled with. And he was saying, like, on set, like, Heath had a great time. He loved being the Joker. And, he was saying, like, with John, I think Heath Ledger had an addiction to sleeping pills back when he was 14 years old, right? And it was absolutely devastating to the whole cast, right? But especially to John, because, like, they would have these deep conversations, and both of them being sober for years, and it was just like they're talking about their sobriety, right? And that's what they'd share, right? Like, they had some special intimate moments talking about their sobriety. And then, for Heath Ledger, a lot of people that were on there were saying, no, Heath was a happy guy. Like, he was actually genuinely happy. And what he overdosed on was sleeping pills, right? But a lot of them, the feeling was consistent. Heath did not pass away from anything that had to do with being so immersed into the Joker and being depressed or anything like that. It had nothing to do with the Joker, which I found peace in, right? Because being the Joker, looking at that character, it could be a very dark character. Now, people that were part of the cast, I know that they mentioned Christian Bale took it really hard with Heath's passing. But even at the press junket. So at the press junket, people, they were saying that, like, it was not only the cast that could feel the sadness, but it was also the press that felt someone was missing, and there was a lot of sadness, right? But then, it kind of ends in something somewhat poetic and beautiful. So Heath Ledger, first actor portraying a comic book character to ever win an Oscar. And boy, did he ever deserve it, right? Like, arguably, he is the best Joker, right? Like, who would you choose at this point? Heath Ledger totally reinvented as to who the Joker was, blew us all away. Like, I think we were all convinced that this guy is the Joker, right? I still think it's between him and Jack. Joaquin, he has his own interpretation. He does a good job. I just don't think he's Joker. So then, after they kind of address Heath's passing, they do get into The Dark Knight Rises for like the last 15 minutes or so. So obviously they have Chuck Dixon, who created Bane, on the film, which I thought was brilliant. You have the creator of Bane who's on here, and one of the first things he kind of points out was, the Bane that was in Batman and Robin was not his Bane. Looked like Bane, but it was not his Bane. Now, the other thing was, from Chuck Dixon's perspective, was people had to respond and relate to Bane. So just like the comics, if you ever read Nightfall, you can find it on Hoopla, or I'm sure that there's an omnibus, and there's many ways as to where you can get Nightfall. But the Cole's notes of it, if you will, was Bane was brilliant. He was intelligent, right? He was a challenge, intellectually and physically, right? So what Chuck Dixon's goal was to create a product of childhood trauma, right? A mirror image of a villain. So Batman was that mirror image. Instead, Batman was a hero, and someone that was almost identical was Bane, but as a villain, right? So the one issue that Chuck Dixon had was the audio of Bane. He was like, okay, well, it's really difficult to understand him. But he did love how Bane was brilliant, intelligent, and a physical challenge. And you see the blueprint as to how Bane was portrayed in The Dark Knight Rises and how he was portrayed in the comic. I mean, there's a couple of different things. Like in the comic, Bane shows up at Bruce Wayne's house. In contrast, like to The Dark Knight Rises, no, it's like more in Bane's lair, but underneath Bane, or on top of Bane's lair, like he's like sitting beneath, it looks like Wayne Industries, where he has all these Batman tools, the Batmobile and all that, right? But with Chris Nolan, he didn't want someone like the Riddler, who would be kind of similar to the Joker. He wanted someone that would be a physical challenge to Batman. So he chose Bane. And then, not only that, fun fact to point out was Glenn Powell. So he's quickly becoming a big character and a big actor. I forget which movie he was in. Something like She's Not Into You, or let me look it up. One sec. Yeah, so I was way off. Anyone But You. So he was even in Rises. So I don't know if you guys remember that bank scene where you can tell he was like acting like that big corporate douchey guy from Wall Street. Well, yeah, he was in the movie. Pretty cool to point out that he was in Dark Knight Rises. Anne Hathaway, she had a reputation. A lot of people were hating on her. They were like, someone from Princess Diaries is going to be Cowan? Yeah, that's not going to happen. And, arguably one of the best Cowan portrayals. It's kind of hard to choose between her and Michelle Pfeiffer as to who played it better. And then obviously Gotham City would be shot in New York. They didn't mention anything about Pittsburgh, though, which I thought was interesting. And then the Bat was actually the brand new vehicle. So rather than calling it the Batwing or anything like that, it was just called the Bat. Now, it could not fly. So what they had was the Bat was kind of held up by a huge pole, and then a car was actually driving it around. So they had to green screen that car out, right, to actually make it seem like the Bat was flying around. But The Dark Knight Rises wasn't that well discussed. I feel like they could have gone much more in depth as to like how that film was made, how Chris was feeling. He knew it was going to be a trilogy, but that was it, right? WB did ask Nolan and Bale to return, both politely declined, and then that's when they started turning their attention to Ben Affleck, right? I mean, Zack Snyder was already making, or he did make, Superman. So, yeah, and that's how the whole episode wrapped up. I thought that in Heath's shadow, they did an excellent job as to who Heath was, and giving huge props to him. And a lot of the fans, like myself, would appreciate this. Like, just getting some insight as to who he was, how he was, his method, his style. The big thing I thought was just hilarious was just him memorizing everyone's lines. The nice touch about including certain actors. I mean, Ramirez was even saying, like, we were absolutely devastated. People were shocked. John Corleone, where his face was just like, sad. He's like, I couldn't believe it. Really difficult to kind of see, what we got. And, there was rumors about Heath coming back, like he signed on for another film. And what could have been. So, but yeah, I thought that overall, Icons Unearthed Batman, I absolutely loved it. I'm glad I watched every minute of it. And I thought it was extremely interesting. I'd love for them to start covering Zack Snyder and his portrayal as to like all the characters. I still don't think it's in that echelon in terms of like, it being like how many people are going to actually come back and talk and share everything that they know, right? You look at Sean Young, who she was sharing and sharing. She just doesn't care. She's unapologetically herself, right? But interesting, right? Maybe 20 years down the line, we might hear more about it. But I thought that the insight between making Begins, the process of getting to Begins, WB opening up the wallet, and then finally like having Chris Nolan, who was just like, listen, we're going to do it as grounded as possible. And he stuck to it all the way through. Anyway, overall, highly recommend you guys watch it. I'm not sure if it's up on YouTube. Last I checked, it was not. But by all means, let me know if you do see it. This was something I enjoyed watching and highly recommend that you guys take a look at. Now, with that said, I am pretty much done here. I think that we're just going to wrap up and I'll let you know where you can find me. So on X/Twitter at Beyond Bat Signal, you can give a follow, shoot a message by all means if you'd like. If you have any comments or questions, shoot me an email, beyondthebatsignal@gmail.com. You can subscribe to Beyond the Bat Signal on the YouTube channel. And please listen, rate, subscribe. Apple Podcasts, there's iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Music. Thank you so much for listening. This is Beyond the Bat Signal, signing off.